My name is Rebecca Langford. I'm 41 years old. At 7:18 on a Friday evening, my mother-in-law handed me a broom in front of 200 donors at her $40,000 charity gala and said, "Since you're so eager to be useful, Rebecca, why don't you start with the spill near table 12? The ballroom went quiet in the way polite people go quiet when cruelty is wearing pearls. My husband, Andrew, stood beside his mother with a glass of champagne in his hand and looked at the floor. Not at me. Not at the broom. Not at the woman who had spent 6 years introducing me as Andrew's little administrative wife. Even though I had built a nonprofit consulting firm from nothing and raised more money for women's shelters than she had ever donated without needing a plaque, my mother-in-law, Margaret Langford, smiled as if she had just made a charming joke. "Go on," she said. "The staff is overwhelmed." I looked at the broom. Then I looked at the embroidered banner above the stage that read the Langford Foundation Annual Hope Gala. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just took the broom from her hand, leaned it gently against the wall, and said, "I think the staff can manage." Margaret's smile thinned. What she didn't know was that 3 months earlier, the foundation board had elected me president after discovering irregularities in the event accounts she had personally controlled. She didn't know I had spent 12 weeks reviewing invoices, donor pledges, vendor contracts, and restricted grant reports. She didn't know the keynote speaker, former Judge Helena Morris, was there at my invitation. And she certainly didn't know that in less than 20 minutes, every person in that ballroom would hear my name from the stage as the new president of the foundation Margaret had treated like her private social club. Before I tell you how a woman who handed me a broom lost the microphone, the board, and the room she thought belonged to her, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who confused your quietness with weakness, like this video, subscribe and stay with me. This is that story. I met Andrew Langford at a charity auction in Hartford, Connecticut on October 4th, 2017 at 8:26 in the evening. I remember the exact time because I had been checking the bidding deadline on a framed watercolor donated by a local artist. I was 32 then, wearing a black dress I had bought on clearance and heels that hurt by the second hour. Andrew was 36, tall, polite, and handsome in the kind of understated way that made older women call him well-raised. He worked as a private wealth advisor at Langford & Pierce, the firm his grandfather had helped start. He had dark brown hair, careful manners, and a soft voice that made him seem thoughtful even when he was simply avoiding conflict. He approached me near the silent auction table and said, "You're either very interested in that painting or very suspicious of the bid sheet." I said both. Someone increased the bid by exactly $1 3 times. That's not generosity, that's strategy. He laughed. "You work in finance?" "Nonprofit development." "So worse." "Much worse." He smiled like he was delighted by me. For the first year, Andrew was gentle. He brought tea to my office when I worked late. He listened when I talked about grant cycles and donor fatigue. He remembered that I hated being called Becky. He told me he admired women who knew how to get things done without needing attention. I should have paid closer attention to that last part. Because in the Langford family, women were allowed to accomplish things only if they did not expect credit. Andrew proposed in May of 2019 in Elizabeth Park beneath a rose arbor after a spring rain. I said yes because I loved him, and because at that time, love still felt like something that could soften everything else. Then I met Margaret properly. I had met her briefly before the engagement, of course. At dinners. At firm events. At holiday receptions where she floated through rooms in silk jackets, greeting people by last name and donation level. But becoming engaged to her son changed her interest in me. I was no longer a woman Andrew was dating. I was a possible permanent object in her family portrait. Margaret Langford was 66, widowed, and wealthy in a way that had become less about money and more about atmosphere. She lived in West Hartford in a Georgian house with blue shutters, silver candlesticks, and a staircase she had photographed more often than some people photograph their children. She chaired committees, hosted luncheons, and spoke often about service. Her version of service usually involved arranging flowers, while other people did the serving. The first time she invited me to lunch alone, she chose the Whitcomb Room, a restaurant where the hostess greeted her by name and seated us near the window. It was June 12th, at 12:04 in the afternoon. Margaret ordered sparkling water without looking at the menu. Then she looked at my hands. "You don't wear much jewelry," she said. "No, I lose things." "How practical." It was not a compliment. She asked about my family. I told her my father had been a high school history teacher in Vermont, and my mother had worked as a librarian. Both were retired. They lived in a modest house outside Burlington and had been married for 43 years. Margaret smiled. "That sounds very sweet." Sweet, in her mouth, meant small. She asked where I had gone to school. I told her Mount Holyoke for undergrad, and then a master's in nonprofit management from Boston University. "Ah," she said, "mission-driven." Mission-driven, in her mouth, meant underpaid. Then she leaned back and said, "Andrew has always been drawn to capable women. The challenge is making sure capability doesn't become hardness." I folded my napkin in my lap. "What does hardness look like to you?" She smiled. "Oh, you'll know it when people stop inviting you into warm rooms." I knew then that Margaret would not be direct, unless she thought she could win. Andrew told me not to worry. "That's just Mom," he said that night while we washed dishes in my apartment kitchen. "She suggested I might become too hard to invite indoors." He laughed softly. "She says things dramatically. She meant it. She likes you. She's assessing me. She assesses everyone. That doesn't make it charming." He kissed my forehead. "Please don't turn this into a thing." That was the first time I heard the phrase that would become the hallway I kept walking down alone. Don't turn this into a thing. When Margaret seated me at the children's table during Thanksgiving because, as she said, "You're not technically family yet," Andrew whispered, "Don't turn this into a thing." When she introduced me to her bridge club as the girl who helps charities write thank you notes, Andrew said later, "Don't turn this into a thing." When she told our wedding florist, "Rebecca's taste is simple, so I'll help elevate it," Andrew squeezed my hand under the table and murmured, "Don't turn this into a thing." I learned that in the Langford family, a thing was any discomfort Margaret did not personally approve. We married on September 19th, 2020, in a small outdoor ceremony because the world was still cautious then. My parents drove down from Vermont. Margaret wore champagne silk and told 3 guests that the wedding was intimate by necessity, as if a larger celebration had been taken from her personally. My father walked me down the aisle at 4:30 in the afternoon, his hand shaking slightly with pride. Andrew cried when he saw me. I believed those tears. I still do. That is the difficult part. Andrew was not a villain in the loud sense. He was not cruel with his own hands. He was worse in the quiet way weak people become dangerous near powerful ones. He loved me when loving me cost him nothing. When it required him to disappoint his mother, he disappeared behind politeness. The Langford Foundation entered my life slowly. It had been founded by Andrew's grandfather in the 1980s after he sold a group of commercial properties and wanted the family name attached to something more graceful than rent checks. Its mission was women's economic stability in Connecticut, emergency housing grants, job training partnerships, child care subsidies, domestic violence transition support. On paper, it did meaningful work. In practice, by the time I married into the family, Margaret had turned the foundation into a social instrument. She was not the legal president, but she chaired the Gala committee and controlled most public-facing donor relationships. The actual president, Thomas Greer, was a tired retired banker who deferred to her because it was easier. The board met quarterly, approved reports prepared by staff, smiled through Margaret's speeches, and enjoyed seeing the Langford name in programs. I attended my first gala as Andrew's wife in November of 2021. The event cost $32,000 and raised $98,000. Margaret called that a triumph. I reviewed the public filing later and noticed only $41,000 had gone directly to program grants that year. The rest had vanished into administrative language that felt too polished to be clean. I mentioned it to Andrew one Sunday morning while he read the business section at our kitchen table. "The gala expenses seem high," I said. He did not look up. "Fundraising costs money." "I know, but this foundation is supposed to support women in crisis, not underwrite floral installations." He sighed. "Mom's events bring in donors." Do they bring in impact? He folded the newspaper. Rebecca, please don't audit my mother's charity over breakfast. It's not her charity. He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw irritation under the gentleness. It's the family foundation. That's also not the same thing. He stood and rinsed his coffee mug. Can we have one peaceful morning? I let it go. Silence was not agreement. It was storage. The pattern sharpened after that. Margaret began inviting me to foundation events, only when she needed labor disguised as inclusion. I was asked to address envelopes, review name tags, proofread donor letters, and call vendors. Whenever I offered strategy, she smiled as if I had tracked mud onto a rug. At a planning meeting in March of 2022, I suggested that the foundation publish a transparent annual impact report showing how many women received housing assistance, legal aid, and childcare support. Margaret tapped her pen against the table. That's very nonprofit of you, Rebecca. I said, it is a nonprofit. The room went still. Thomas Greer coughed into his fist. Margaret's smile did not move. Yes, dear, she said, but donors respond to inspiration, not spreadsheets. I've raised 7-figure campaigns with both. Her eyes narrowed for half a second. Then she turned to the florist and said, let's return to the tablescapes. Andrew, who had come to pick me up, heard enough of the exchange from the doorway. In the car, he said, you embarrassed Mom today. I corrected her. In front of the committee. She dismissed me in front of the committee. He gripped the steering wheel. You know how she is. Yes, I said, that is the problem. At 6:40 that evening, Margaret called me. Rebecca, she said, I want to clear the air. I stood in my home office, looking at grant proposals stacked beside my laptop. All right. I know you have experience in your little consulting world. I looked at the wall. But family institutions are delicate. People don't respond well to being corrected by newcomers. I wasn't correcting donors. I was discussing accountability. She laughed lightly. Such a heavy word. It should be. Well, she said, voice cooling, perhaps the foundation is not the right place for your particular energy. I said, perhaps not. But it was. She simply didn't know that yet. By 2023, my own firm, Langford Grant Strategy, though I still used my married name professionally, had grown from 1 client to 14. I worked with women's shelters, food security coalitions, workforce development nonprofits, and community health clinics. I had a reputation for being calm under pressure and exact with money. If an organization had a donor retention problem, a grant compliance mess, or a board that liked applause more than governance, they called me. I built it in silence. Margaret did not notice because the work did not happen in ballrooms. The first crack in her foundation control appeared on January 9, 2024, at 3:18 in the afternoon. I received a call from Elena Park, the foundation's program director. Elena was 45, sharp, exhausted, and far more competent than the board deserved. We had spoken occasionally at events. She knew what I did for work. She also knew I knew how to read financial smoke. Her voice was quiet. Rebecca, do you have a few minutes? Yes. I need to ask something carefully. I closed my office door. She said, if a restricted donation is made for emergency housing grants, can it be temporarily held for Gala expenses if reimbursement is expected later? No. That's what I thought. Elena, what happened? A pause. Then she said, I can't discuss details unless I know you're willing to help formally. Formally, how? The finance committee is meeting next week. Thomas is worried. Some board members want an outside review. Why are you calling me instead of a forensic accountant? Because if we bring in someone external first, Margaret will turn it into an attack. If you review as a consultant with family connection and professional credentials, the board may survive the politics long enough to act. I almost smiled at the irony. For years, Margaret had treated me as decorative labor. Now my invisibility made me useful. What are we looking at? I asked. Elena exhaled. Vendor overbilling. Restricted funds used for event deposits. Donor pledges counted twice. And a $75,000 women's shelter grant that was delayed because cash was tied up in Gala obligations. My hand tightened around the phone. Which shelter? Harbor House. I knew Harbor House. I had consulted with them after a flood damaged their transitional apartments. They served women leaving violent homes. A delayed grant there did not mean a late brochure. It meant rooms not repaired, security systems not upgraded, children waiting in unsafe situations. "When is the meeting?" I asked. "Next Wednesday, 5:30. "I'll be there." Andrew did not want me to attend. When I told him that evening, he sat on the edge of our bed and rubbed his forehead. "Rebecca, this is exactly what I was afraid of." "What were you afraid of?" "You getting pulled into foundation drama. Restricted housing funds may have been used to pay Gala vendors." He looked pained. "Mom would never steal." "I didn't say steal." "You're implying it." "I'm saying money may have been misused." "It's complicated." "No, it's inconvenient. That's different." He stood. "If you go after my mother, it will destroy this family." I looked at him for a long moment. "Andrew, if your family can be destroyed by accounting, the accounting is not the problem." He left the room. At 5:30 the following Wednesday, I sat in a private conference room at the foundation office with Thomas Greer, Elena Park, 2 board members named Cynthia Wells and Martin Shaw, and a speakerphone connected to Abigail Reed, the foundation's outside counsel. Margaret had not been invited. Thomas looked 10 years older than he had at the last gala. He slid a folder toward me and said, "We need discretion. You need accuracy first." Cynthia Wells, a retired hospital executive with silver hair and no patience for nonsense, gave the smallest smile. For 3 hours we reviewed documents, vendor invoices, donor restrictions, wire transfers, reimbursement requests, email approvals from Margaret that used phrases like "borrow from housing temporarily" and "donors will never care about internal timing." There was a $22,000 floral deposit paid from funds restricted for emergency relocation grants. A $9,800 champagne wall deposit coded as donor cultivation. $3,400 in custom monogrammed napkins listed under community outreach. A $12,000 photography package split across 2 program categories to avoid board questions. No one spoke for a full minute after the last invoice. Then Cynthia said, "Well, a napkin's better have solved poverty." Thomas covered his eyes. I said, "This is fixable only if you act before the gala." Martin frowned. "The gala is in 11 weeks. Then you have 11 weeks to stop pretending this is a taste issue." Outside counsel spoke through the phone. "The bylaws allow emergency board action if restricted funds are at risk." Thomas looked at me. "What would you recommend?" I thought of Margaret calling my consulting world little. I thought of Harbor House waiting for money while donors drank champagne under her name. Freeze discretionary event spending immediately. Notify affected restricted donors before they hear rumors. Replace gala leadership. Appoint an interim president with authority to restructure controls. Restore restricted funds from the operating reserve. Publish a clean impact statement within 30 days after the gala. Thomas swallowed. Who would agree to become interim president in this mess? No one looked at me at first, then Elena did. I said, "No." Cynthia said, "You're the obvious choice." "I'm Margaret's daughter-in-law." "That makes it ugly," Martin said. "Not wrong." I shook my head. "She'll call it revenge." Cynthia leaned forward. "Is it?" "No." "Then let her call it weather if she wants." I almost laughed. Thomas said, "You know the mission, you know the donors, you know the compliance issues. And you're connected enough to understand the family politics, but independent enough to fix them. Andrew will hate this." Cynthia's face softened slightly. "Rebecca," she said, "we are not appointing Andrew's comfort." That sentence settled in me like a key turning. The board voted on February 2nd at 7:48 in the evening. Margaret was removed from Gala Financial Authority. Thomas resigned as president but remained on the board during transition. I was elected interim president of the Langford Foundation, effective immediately, with a formal announcement planned for the gala after donors were privately briefed. Margaret was told only that spending controls had changed pending review. She called me the next morning at 8:22. "What have you done?" she asked. "Good morning, Margaret." Do not patronize me. I'm not. Thomas says the board is reviewing gala approvals. Suddenly, vendors are calling Elena instead of me. That sounds appropriate. Her breath sharpened. You? I said nothing. You wormed your way into this. I was asked to review documents. You have wanted to embarrass me from the beginning. No. I wanted the foundation to fund the women it promised to help. She laughed once, hard and bitter. Do you know what donors expect from this family? Integrity? They expect continuity, elegance, confidence, and audited books. Her voice dropped. You listen to me, Rebecca. You may know spreadsheets, but I know rooms. I know donors. I know what makes people open their checkbooks. You will not walk into my foundation and make me look foolish. I looked at the file on my desk. Floral deposit, champagne wall, delayed shelter grant. Margaret, I said, I'm not making you look like anything. I hung up before she could answer. Andrew came home late that night. He stood in the kitchen doorway while I loaded the dishwasher. Mom says the board blindsided her. The board acted. Because of you. Because of documents. He loosened his tie. You could have warned me. I did. You called it drama. He looked wounded. That was one of Andrew's gifts. He could make your disappointment look like an attack on him. She's my mother, he said. I know. You should have considered what this would do to her. I considered what it already did to Harbor House. He stared at me. Can you stop talking like an attorney for 1 minute? I placed a plate in the rack carefully. I'm talking like a woman who knows what emergency housing money is for. He shook his head. You don't understand family loyalty. I closed the dishwasher. No, Andrew, I understand it too well. I just don't confuse loyalty with covering receipts. He slept in the guest room that night. The next 10 weeks were a steady and controlled fire. Margaret continued planning the gala socially, because removing her entirely before the event would have caused donor gossip the foundation could not afford. But every contract, payment, table assignment, and program line went through Elena and me. We canceled the champagne tower. Margaret told everyone it was too expected. We reduced the floral budget by half. Margaret told donors she preferred cleaner lines this year. We redirected $28,000 back into Harbor House repairs. Margaret told no one. Privately, the board briefed major donors. Not dramatically. Carefully. Restricted funds had been mishandled. Controls had been corrected. Leadership transition would be announced. The mission was being restored. Most donors were relieved. A few were angry. One woman, Marjorie Ellis, whose late daughter had escaped domestic abuse through a shelter program, said on a donor call, I don't care what flowers are on the table. I care whether the money reaches the locked doors women are hiding behind. I wrote that sentence in my notebook. Margaret, meanwhile, became more dangerous because she felt power leaving but could not yet see where it had gone. At a committee walkthrough on March 22nd at 11 in the morning, she criticized my dress in front of the event planner. Rebecca, black again? She said. You dress like you're attending a deposition. I looked at my navy dress. This is blue. Is it? The planner stared at her clipboard. At another meeting, she told a volunteer, Rebecca is helping with the practical details. She's very good behind the scenes. I said, behind the scenes is where the money moves. Margaret's smile froze. At home, Andrew grew quieter, not kinder, quieter. He stopped asking about the gala. He took calls from his mother in the garage. He avoided my office when the foundation files were open. On April 3rd, at 9:34 in the evening, he finally said, Maybe you shouldn't go to the gala. I looked up from my laptop. Excuse me? It may inflame things. I'm the foundation president. That hasn't been announced. It will be announced there. He rubbed both hands over his face. Do you hear yourself? My mother built that gala. No staff built it. Vendors built it. Donors funded it. Women in crisis justified it. Margaret decorated it. His face hardened. You hate her. No. You do. I don't hate Margaret. I understand her. That's worse. It usually is. He stood in the doorway looking suddenly younger than 42. Are you trying to make me choose? I closed my laptop. No, Andrew. You have been choosing for 6 years. I'm just no longer pretending not to notice. He slept in the guest room again. On April 15th, I met with Judge Helena Morris, our keynote speaker, at a cafe near the courthouse. She was 72, retired from the state appellate bench, and famous for speaking softly while making powerful people regret imprecision. She had served on domestic violence reform commissions for decades and had known my grandmother through philanthropic circles. She reviewed the program changes while drinking black coffee. "So Margaret doesn't know I'll introduce you?" she asked. "She knows there will be a leadership announcement. But not that it's you." "Correct." Judge Morris smiled faintly. "That explains the board's insistence on security near the stage." I said, "I don't want spectacle." "My dear, truth becomes spectacle only when people have invested heavily in lies." That was the kind of sentence Margaret would have called dramatic if she were not afraid of the woman saying it. The gala was held on May 10th at the Whitcomb Grand Ballroom in Hartford. Tickets were $250 each. Corporate tables started at $5,000. The final event budget, after corrections, was $40,000 exactly, down from Margaret's original $78,000. The theme was Still Standing, chosen by Elena and approved by the board. Margaret hated it. "Too severe," she said during the final walkthrough. I said, "Appropriate for emergency housing work." She looked at me. "You enjoy making everything heavy." "No," I said. "I just remember who we're here for." The night of the gala, I arrived at 5:40 in the evening wearing a dark emerald gown with long sleeves, my hair pinned low, and my grandmother's pearl earrings. Not my grandmother by blood. My mother's mother, Alice, a librarian from Vermont who had left me her earrings in her habit of writing due dates on everything. I wore them because I wanted one woman in the room who had loved me without performance. Elena met me near the service entrance with a tablet in one hand and panic in neither eye. "Everything is on schedule," she said. "Any issues?" Margaret changed 2 table cards. "To move whom?" Herself closer to Judge Morris. "Move them back." "Already done." I smiled. "That's why you should be paid more." I put that in the revised budget. At 6, donors began arriving. The ballroom glowed with warm gold light, white linens, restrained flowers, simple stage design, no champagne tower. On each table sat a card telling the story of one anonymized grant recipient, a woman who escaped with 2 children and needed first month's rent, a nursing student who needed emergency childcare, a mother who needed a security deposit after leaving a dangerous home. The room looked less like Margaret and more like the mission. That was the first victory. Margaret arrived at 6:13 in a silver gown, diamonds at her throat, and Andrew beside her. He wore a black tuxedo and the expression of a man being led to court by both sides. Margaret kissed donors, touched elbows, laughed lightly, and pretended not to notice that the staff answered to Elena. At 6:34, she approached me near the registration table. "Rebecca," she said, "you're standing in the traffic flow." "I'm greeting board members." "How ambitious." Andrew looked at me, then at the floor. I said, "Good evening, Margaret." She leaned closer, still smiling for the room. "Enjoy your little moment tonight," she said. "Rooms remember who belongs in them." I looked around the ballroom. Donors, shelter directors, board members, volunteers, survivors, staff. "Yes," I said, "they do." Dinner was served at 7, herb chicken, roasted vegetables, lemon risotto. Margaret complained the plates looked institutional. Elena whispered to me, "I have seen institutions with bigger budgets." I did not laugh because Margaret was watching. At 7:16, a server near table 12 bumped a water pitcher. Ice and water spilled across the floor near the side aisle. It was minor. 2 staff members moved immediately with towels. Margaret saw an opportunity before she saw a spill. She crossed the room, picked up a broom from the service alcove, and walked toward me with the slow confidence of someone who believed every eye would interpret her cruelty as wit. At 7:18, she held it out. "Since you're so eager to be useful, Rebecca, why don't you start with the spill near table 12? The nearby conversations faded. Cynthia Wells turned in her chair. Elena went completely still. Andrew looked down. Margaret smiled. "Go on," she said. "The staff is overwhelmed." I looked at the broom, then at her hand, then at the room she thought she controlled. Short sentences at emotional peaks. That is what my mind does under pressure. I saw the broom, I saw my husband's silence, I saw Margaret's diamonds, I saw Elena's face. I saw the table cards telling stories of women who had been handed worse than brooms and still kept moving. I took it, not because she had won, because I wanted the room to remember the exact object. I leaned the broom gently against the wall. "I think the staff can manage," I said. Margaret's eyes sharpened. "You don't want to help?" "I am helping." "How?" I looked at the stage where Judge Morris was reviewing her notes. "You'll hear shortly." For the first time that night, uncertainty crossed Margaret's face. She recovered quickly. "How mysterious," she said. "No," I said, "just scheduled." She returned to her table. Andrew did not move. At 7:36, Cynthia leaned toward me and whispered, "That woman just handed the president a broom." I said yes. Cynthia said, "I almost admire the efficiency of her self-destruction." If you're still watching, drop a comment below with the words "quiet power." If you've ever had someone try to humiliate you publicly and then discover you were standing exactly where you belonged. Subscribe to Revenge Chronicles for more stories about women who let the truth arrive on time. At 7:42, Elena dimmed the lights. Thomas Greer approached the podium first. He looked nervous, but resolved. "Good evening," he said. "Welcome to the Langford Foundation's annual Hope Gala." Polite applause filled the room. He thanked donors, staff, community partners, and volunteers. He mentioned that the foundation had spent recent months strengthening its governance, refocusing on restricted giving, and recommitting to direct support for women's economic safety. Margaret's posture stiffened. Then Thomas said, "Before we welcome our keynote speaker, I want to acknowledge a leadership transition that marks a new chapter for this foundation." The room shifted. Margaret looked at Andrew. Andrew looked at me. I sat still. Thomas continued, "After years of service, I have stepped down as president. The board has elected a leader with deep nonprofit expertise, strong fiduciary discipline, and a clear commitment to making sure every promised dollar reaches the women it was intended to serve." Margaret's mouth parted slightly. Thomas turned toward Judge Morris. "It is my honor to welcome former Judge Helena Morris." Judge Morris walked to the podium with no hurry at all. She wore a midnight blue suit, a silver brooch, and the expression of someone who had sentenced men who thought they were untouchable. Her voice was calm. "Thank you, Thomas. Before I speak about the work ahead, I want to tell you about the woman who now leads this foundation." Margaret did not blink. Judge Morris continued, "She is not loud. She is not performative. She does not mistake elegance for ethics or activity for impact. She has spent her career helping organizations do the difficult private work required to keep public promises." A murmur moved through the ballroom. "She reviewed this foundation's records when questions needed answers. She helped restore restricted funds to their proper purpose. She insisted that emergency housing grants be treated not as accounting categories, but as lifelines." Margaret's face went pale. Judge Morris smiled slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the new president of the Langford Foundation, Rebecca Langford." For 1 second there was silence. Then applause rose. Not explosive. Not theatrical. Stronger than that. Real. Elena stood first. Then Cynthia. Then Martin. Then Marjorie Ellis. Then an entire table from Harbor House. Within seconds, half the ballroom was on its feet. Margaret remained seated. Andrew stood slowly, as if his knees had been given instructions late. I walked to the stage. The broom still leaned against the wall near table 12. I did not look at it until I reached the podium. Then I looked once, deliberately, and several people followed my gaze. Margaret saw them see it. That was the public payoff, not revenge. Recognition. I adjusted the microphone. "Thank you, Judge Morris. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you to every donor, partner, staff member, and volunteer here tonight." My voice was steady. This foundation was created to support women rebuilding safety. That word, safety, can sound simple to those who have always had it. A safe door. A safe account. A safe ride. A safe place to sleep. For many women, safety is not a feeling. It is a deposit, a bus ticket, a repaired lock, a legal document, a childcare payment, a hotel room for one more night. The room went completely still. For that reason, leadership here must be more than beautiful events and familiar names. It must be stewardship. It must be accuracy. It must be humility before the women whose lives are affected by decisions made in rooms like this. I saw Margaret's fingers tighten around her napkin. I continued. Over the past several months, the board has taken necessary steps to strengthen financial controls, restore restricted funds, and ensure donor intent is honored without exception. Tonight, I am pleased to announce that the delayed Harbor House Emergency Repair Grant has been fully funded, released, and matched by an anonymous donor for a total of $150,000. The Harbor House table erupted first. Marjorie Ellis wiped her eyes. Elena exhaled like she had been holding her breath since January. I looked at the crowd, not at Margaret. That means more secure rooms, more working locks, more families moved out of danger faster. That is what this foundation exists to do. Applause came again. This time, Margaret stood, not because she wanted to, because remaining seated had become more visible than standing. After my remarks, Judge Morris delivered the keynote. She spoke about women who are dismissed until their paperwork saves them, about money as a moral instrument, about the difference between charity as performance and charity as repair. She never mentioned Margaret. She did not need to. At 8:25, during the dessert course, Margaret approached me near the side hallway. Her face was composed, but her voice was not. "You planned that?" "Yes. You let me stand here all evening not knowing. You were informed there would be a leadership announcement. You humiliated me." I looked at the broom still near the service alcove, now removed from the wall by a staff member who looked mildly terrified of touching history. "No, Margaret. You handed me the prop." Her eyes flashed. "I built this gala. You overspent on it. I built relationships. You used some of them to hide bad accounting. How dare you? I reviewed the invoices." She stepped closer. "You are nothing but a social climber with a clipboard." I could have responded sharply. I wanted to. There was a sentence sitting on my tongue with edges sharp enough to draw blood. Instead, I breathed once. "You're removed from financial authority," I said. "You may continue as a donor if you wish. You may attend public events if you behave appropriately. You will not approve contracts, direct staff, control vendor payments, or represent yourself as foundation leadership." Her mouth trembled, not with sadness, with rage denied an audience. Andrew appeared behind her. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "can we not do this here?" I turned to him. "We are doing it here because for 6 years, here is where your mother has performed authority she no longer has." He looked wounded again. But this time, it did not move me. Margaret said, "Andrew, are you going to let your wife speak to me this way?" There it was, the old lever, the command hidden as injury. Andrew looked between us. For once, he had no floor left to steady. He said, "Mom, maybe we should go." It was not defense. It was not courage. But it was the first time he had not asked me to shrink so she could stand taller. Margaret stared at him. Then she picked up her silver clutch and walked out of the ballroom at 8:38. People noticed. Of course they did. People always notice exits from rooms built on appearances. But no one followed, except Andrew. I watched him go. Cynthia came to stand beside me. "Are you all right?" she asked. I looked around the ballroom. Donors speaking with shelter directors. Elena laughing for the first time all night. Judge Morris accepting coffee from a volunteer. The Harbor House table passing tissues and pledge cards. "Yes," I said, "I think I am." The gala raised $286,000 that night. After expenses, restored controls, and matched grants, more direct program funding went out in the next 60 days than in the previous 2 years combined. Margaret did not attend the next board meeting. Andrew came home late after the gala. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my shoes off, reviewing the preliminary pledge report. It was 12:15 in the morning. He stood in the doorway. "She's devastated," he said. I looked up. "I imagine." She feels publicly shamed. She publicly shamed me with a broom. His face tightened. That was wrong. I waited. He swallowed. I should have said something. Yes. I froze. No, I said gently. You chose. That hurt him. I saw it land. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me. I don't know how to be between you and my mother. I'm not asking you to be between us. I'm asking you to stand somewhere. He looked down at his hands. What happens now? I closed the report. I don't know. That was the most honest thing I had said to him in months. We tried counseling. For a while. Dr. Karen Holt. Tuesday evenings at 6. Beige office. Soft lamps. A box of tissues, neither of us touched. Andrew learned language for enmeshment, conflict avoidance, emotional outsourcing. I learned that understanding why someone failed you does not automatically repair the failure. He apologized. Sometimes well. Sometimes with too many explanations. Margaret sent one handwritten note that said, I regret that emotions ran high at the gala. I placed it in a drawer and never answered. 3 months later, Andrew moved into a short-term apartment downtown. We did not call it separation at first. People rarely name endings until the furniture has already left. In September, we filed quietly. Margaret told her friends the marriage had failed because my career had hardened me. I heard this from Cynthia, who heard it at a museum luncheon and nearly choked on cucumber water. I did not correct the story publicly. The people who mattered knew. Elena knew. The board knew. Harbor House knew. I knew. The foundation changed. Not overnight. Institutions rarely do. But steadily. We published quarterly impact reports. We created donor restriction protocols. We capped event spending. We added 2 survivor advocates to the advisory council and paid them for their time. We moved the annual gala from the Whitcomb Grand Ballroom to a community arts center the next year and raised more money with fewer orchids. At that gala, no one handed me a broom, but near the end of the night, a volunteer named Paula brought me a small gift wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a tiny silver broom charm on a keychain. The card said, for clearing the room. I laughed so hard, Elena had to take the microphone from me. I keep that keychain in my desk drawer now, beside the first corrected financial report and a thank you letter from Harbor House. The letter says that the repaired security doors helped reopen 6 transitional apartments by winter. 6 apartments. 6 doors. 6 women and their children who did not care what Margaret thought of the centerpieces. That is the part 1. Return to whenever I feel the old sting. Because humiliation tries to make the moment about the person humiliating you. Their voice, their smile, their audience, their power. But purpose widens the room. Margaret wanted me remembered as the woman holding a broom. Instead, that broom became the last object she ever handed me before the foundation remembered its mission. I do not hate her. Hate would keep her too close. I understand her now as a woman who confused control with respect and elegance with goodness. She wanted to be admired for charity without being accountable to the people charity was supposed to serve. She wanted the glow of generosity without the discipline of stewardship. And Andrew? I loved him. That is still true. But love cannot survive forever as a private apology for public silence. A marriage cannot ask one person to absorb every insult so the other person can remain comfortable at dinner. Sometimes betrayal is not the cruel sentence. Sometimes betrayal is the person standing beside it, saying nothing. I have learned that public humiliation is only powerful when you accept the role being assigned to you. If someone hands you a broom, you do not have to become the maid in their story. You can set it down. You can walk to the stage. You can let the keynote speaker say your name correctly. You can remember who you are before the room is told. To every woman watching who has been belittled at a family dinner, dismissed in a boardroom, mocked at a wedding, or treated like help in a house she helped build, I want you to hear me clearly. Your calm is not consent. Your silence is not proof that they were right. Sometimes you are simply waiting until the facts are assembled, the microphone is on, and the truth no longer needs your anger to be heard. Do not waste your strength trying to convince people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Build in silence. Document carefully, stand where you belong. And when the moment comes, do not grab the broom and perform the role they wrote for you. Lean it against the wall. Let them wonder why you are smiling. Then walk to the stage that was yours all along. Thank you for spending this time with Rebecca's story. I know many women understand what it feels like to be underestimated by people who only notice your value when they need your labor, your polish, or your silence. If this story reminded you that dignity does not have to shout, stay with Revenge Chronicles. Follow and subscribe for more stories about women who let patience, proof, and quiet courage speak louder than cruelty ever could. So tell me in the comments, have you ever been publicly humiliated by someone who had no idea you were the most powerful person in the room?